and welcome to another episode of When I Grow Up, the podcast on a quest to uncover and celebrate unique paths to fulfillment and joy in our work lives. I'm Nicolette, and today I'm speaking with Meri McCoy-Thompson, all the way from California in the US. This was a really interesting conversation, not only to learn more about Mary's career in the non-profit space, working across different causes and all across the world, but it's also been a true masterclass in resilience. What resilience is, how to recognize it, how to build it, and how to make sense of it in our lives and our careers. I learned so much from Meri throughout this conversation, and I'm sure that you will too. Hi, Meri. Welcome to When I Grow Up.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you, Nicolette.
I was thinking yesterday, when's the last time we actually saw each other in person? Because obviously we did that project with the Human Needs Project together in Nairobi in 2013-14, I believe it was. But then I remembered it was actually in Cape Town when Jeremy and I had the coffee shop. And yeah, and your whole family came over and we went for dinner.
Yes,
And so that was just an awesome memory.
exactly. No, I was talking about it with my family too. I'm like, remember Nicolette? I'm going to be talking to her. And we're talking about our fun time in Cape Town. It was lovely. Yeah.
Awesome. And so much actually happened since then. So I'm really keen to get into, all of that,
Yeah.
what your journey has been like since then, the work that you're doing now, the book, and so on. But I thought what might be a really nice place to start is thinking a little bit about your childhood and especially what in your childhood gave the lead to some of your early career decisions.
So I was kind of a nerdy girl, quiet, shy, didn't have a lot of friends when I was young, and I was a big reader, loved to read all the time. So that had a big effect on me. I will say I didn't have a lot of conversations with my family about handling emotions or emotional life, all the things that I'm into now. And there's no learning in school. And as much as my parents try to manage their emotions, I saw a lot of conflict. People were not able to put their feelings into words. And my parents were actually divorced. My dad left when I was 12. So that was pretty traumatic. A lot of things and I had a lot of struggles with friends. I was excluded from all these groups. And I had the good fortune of starting to make good friends in middle school when I was 11 or 12 and had those good friends all the way through. And I learned the importance of relationships and I learned how to invest myself in relationships and pretty much changed my life. From then on, it was a theme in my life on how to maintain relationships, how to do that. And so that was one theme that was really important. And I think another theme has always been true. And I saw that with both my parents, particularly my mom, was service. And how can we use our gifts in service to the world? And I actually grew up Catholic, and my Catholicism was of the type of social justice. So the priests that were in my church, they marched with Cesar Chavez, which is around agricultural workers, and they spilled their blood on the Trident missiles, protesting nuclear arms. So it was like, what can we do to change the world, to make the world a better place? I would say all of those influences helped me so that even when I wrote my application to college, it was all about how can I serve the world? And I was pretty much in that place. So I would say that's how my early life influenced my career decisions.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So many of the women that I've spoken to so far that work in more these, social justice or impact
Yeah.
spaces, for a lot of them, it's been a reaction to their childhood. But what I hear from you is there's an element of that, but that you also had this really strong modeling.
Yes, I did. I did. My mother marched in the campaigns. Yes, she absolutely did a lot of service, whether it was political, volunteering, all of that. Yeah, and my father, he worked in city government. Yes, definitely modeling for sure.
That's so powerful. And then you started out your career in, I think, actually through a Catholic organization in the impact
Yeah.
space, if I'm correct. But
Yes.
maybe you can take us through just, yeah, how would you describe your career?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because the reality is I have pivoted a lot. My whole career has been in nonprofits, and it's really been generally in the health and education space. But, other people would look and they're like, you did this and then you did that. So I went to university, then I went straight to graduate school from university. And from there, I worked for Catholic Relief Services in West Africa. And I did that because it's like, where's the biggest need? And that's kind of what I felt. Now, I ended up getting very ill there, got malaria several times, and I just was really ill. So we came back to the US and I worked in a research organization, which I really liked learning about all those things. I really like learning, but I learned, I just already said relationships are really important. And therefore, as an extrovert, a research organization wasn't the best fit, even though they were doing great, interesting, service oriented work. And so I actually made a pretty big pivot because I was doing all international work, I did a pretty big pivot and worked in an organization that worked on preventive healthcare for kids. But it was they were doing national guidelines, and I was project director for that. And I worked with great people. So I was like, wow, I really learned the value. If you work with great people on important work, it's so revitalizing. Who you work with matters for me the most, actually, as well as long as you're doing important work. I mean, meaningful work, however you define important. So I did that. And then we moved to California, and I worked with our church for a while, basically doing family engagement. Then, as you know, moved to India, and I worked on an AIDS project in India, which was really interesting. Again, working with good people. Moving back to the US, then I worked in for girls' education in Afghanistan. So again, each time, like, I'm pivoting different types of work, all in the nonprofit space, all trying to, like, how can I use my gifts to help people the most? So that's sort of a driving force as I'm looking at all these organizations. Then I worked in Kenya with you for an amazing project, Human Needs Project in Kibera, and that, doing great work there. And then when that was over, at some point I forgot I was working in Beijing. I didn't do this exactly in order. Again, I moved to Beijing and worked for social entrepreneurs in Beijing. So each time looking, like you said, the impact space, what difference can I make, where I'm at, and how can I use my skills? A lot of it was sort of managerial skills, communication, those kinds of things. But it wasn't until I got to my current job that I really hit a theme that I felt was foundational for all the other jobs. I felt like all the work that I've done sort of has come together because in my current role, in my current organization, I started understanding the importance of resilience and how it's a foundational skill that impacts everything we do and makes the difference between whether we thrive or not. So it has just so big of implications. It's like, oh wow, if I can do some work that helps all of us improve our resilience, it's the furthest upstream I could go in solving all the other problems that I've been trying to solve, whether it's education, healthcare, or everything else.
You triggered something in me when you were talking through your story, and in the beginning you rightly said that many people, I don't know if it's most people, choose a career and they try to stick with that for the rest of their life, or at least that's the more traditional model, whereas you had all these pivots not only on the type of projects but also across different countries. And I think that's something that I think will sound adventurous to many people, but then how do I actually make that happen? Security, continuity. And so I'm just really curious how you approach that and whether there was any of that kind of fear, like, oh, should I just go back to the US and actually, get a job that's going to be a multi-decade gig?
It's so interesting. It's so interesting you say that. Yes, there was a lot of struggles trying to find those jobs, trying to, remarket myself. Every single time, it's like you have to redevelop your network. So my LinkedIn is made up of all sorts of different type of people because I have people in all those different types of fields that we just talked about, right? So yes, it was super challenging. Don't want to undercut that at all. And I never considered doing it differently because I'm so aware that we have one life to live. We only have one life. We can't do this again. So holding on to the edge and like being afraid, like why? And the thing is, I'd rather be challenged and struggle trying to find a job that's meaningful and fits me than be struggling in a job that's unfulfilling and that it doesn't fit my career or my values or who I want to be in the world.
Absolutely. And your values and who you are changes over time, your values in the sense of what's important to you. And so I think there the pivoting becomes important. but it always goes with a trade-off. And I think being really eyes wide open at what that trade-off is. So again, if it's financial security, then what's the trade-off of that? That you might be in a job that's not fulfilling. And sometimes you have to make that trade-off consciously. But I think being really honest about that with yourself can help a lot of that kind of mental discontent that you might feel if you're really clear about why am I making a decision, and then this is going to be the consequences of that decision, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And the other question is we don't know how long our life's going to be. And that was the other thing I was aware of. I had several friends who died in their 20s. I had a good uncle who died. Steve's uncle died when we were 30. So I was also aware that no minute is guaranteed to us. That's the other thing about putting things off, is that a lot of people put things off and then don't get that chance.
One of the themes of this podcast is around authenticity, and how do you actually know who you are authentically, and then how do you show up authentically in the work that you do. And something that I found really hard working across different markets is actually showing up authentically. In some markets like Kenya, I found it extremely easy. I think it was more similar to my South African upbringing. In others, like let's say the Netherlands, or even some of the work I did in Ethiopia, I just actually struggled to understand the culture and how to be authentically myself within that. What were some of the lessons that you learned around authenticity?
I think a lot of what you're talking about is using self-reflection. It's interesting you say that because, I mean, I know people who are, quote, authentic, Americans particularly, right? Authentic wherever they go. We're just going to be whoever we are and you all are going to adapt to it, right? Americans certainly have that stereotype. And I don't think that's necessarily helpful either. I would say be authentic to who you are, but also be open to listening, paying attention to, and seeing what's happening with yourself and within the other culture. One of the reasons I love being in other cultures is I learn so much about myself, right? I learn, oh, you can do things in different ways. You can say things in different ways. One of the things I remember about Kenya, especially working in Kibera, if you were in a meeting with the elders, they would talk 20 minutes, 30 minutes at a time before you responded. And I'm like, I can't remember what they said at the beginning if I'm supposed to wait 30 minutes. So it's just an example of like, wow, this is a conversation style that's completely different than I'm used to. And so can I show up authentically? Well, I couldn't show up as my normal self because that was not how it was being done in that particular types of meetings. And yet I could bring my listening place and my learning self, right? So I could bring different parts of me into a situation. And I could say, I can't do this for the long term because it doesn't feel comfortable to me. One of the reasons we were only in Beijing for a year, like my husband's contract was extended and we could have continued in that work, but I don't speak Mandarin. I tried to learn it and I didn't get very far. So I'm like, I don't want to be a long time in a country that I don't speak the language. So I'll go there. I learned a ton in the year I was there, so much, and I really enjoyed it, but I couldn't be there for a long time. That's okay too. Whether it's international or the next city or maybe the next job, there are places that we're not going to feel comfortable, that don't bring out the best sides of ourselves. And I think I would name it that rather than not being authentic.
Two very different things resonated there with me. The one was around the language. And I think that was one of the things that was tricky in the Netherlands. Although in the end, speak and understand Dutch pretty fluently, couldn't express my humor in Dutch. Like Afrikaans humor is very different to Dutch humor. And one of the
Yeah.
things that I've always, prided myself on is being quite funny. But then I couldn't be funny in Dutch. And that was, quite confronting. It feels like a simple thing, but that was quite important to me. But the other thing was about what you can learn about yourself. And one of the things that was most confronting to me was that the Dutch think they're very direct, but I think South Africans are like 10 times more direct. And I had to really work on kind of smoothing some of my rough edges and being like, it's not that kind of like live or die, today. We can take a month or 3 months or a year to solve this problem. Whereas in South Africa, it was very much like, everything is from a survival, not only physical, but, also financial, etc. Perspective. So when you go into a work meeting, you have to solve things now and go on to the next thing. Whereas the Dutch like to talk and take in everyone's opinion. And that's actually been something that was a huge growth opportunity for me. But in the beginning, I saw it as a conflict in culture and something that just I couldn't work in. And so it's really true what you're saying. A lot of times we feel I can't be authentic, but I think it just shows up a completely different mirror that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise and challenges you to see where you need to grow.
Yeah, in our work we call that cultural resilience when we learn about how other people the lens that other people have on their eyes, and then we understand the strengths of other people's cultures and other people's cultural patterns, and we're like, "Oh, okay." And we can honor that as well as those of our own.
Yeah, that's super important. I think if you want to sustainably be successful in another country, but personally successful. And what I saw that some people do is they then go into their own circle. And I also had that tendency to only mix with South Africans and to complain
Yes.
every weekend about how it went during the week. And it just becomes a snowball. Whereas I think if you do the hard work of building that cultural resilience, I think you called it beautifully. It feels confronting, but in the longer term, it's just better for you. I wanted to segue a little bit because one of the things that I saw on your LinkedIn is that you said you had the insight that social transformation requires personal transformation.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
I tell you, it's something I've heard a lot in my life. And honestly, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to buy into it. I was sort of like, well, that's good for those people. That's what they're doing. Fine. But I'm going to keep working on social transformation. Yeah, hubris of youth. Anyway, and I did not recognize that ultimately, in order to make change, we have to work together better. So we have in our work, the We Are Resilient approach, we have three buckets of skills. We have collaborating skills, connecting skills, and centering skills. And we also talk about patterns that get in our way. But collaborating skills, that's when you work with a team, any kind of group, and you want to make change. You want to solve something, do something, right? Ultimately, I think that's where we're going to solve our problems in the world today, right? We work together when we come up with solutions. That's where how most big problems have been solved. And in order to have good collaborating skills, it's helpful to be able to connect with people. And in order to be able to connect with people, we need to be centered in ourselves. We are more effective. We can do more when we are calmer, when we understand who we are, when we use resilient mindsets. Ultimately, for me, it actually comes down to love. When we speak with love to people, they can hear us. When we speak with anger, they cannot. How do we think social transformation is going to happen if we're berating people and shaming people? People have this idea that shame works. It actually has never worked. It's one of the least successful skills, but it's one that people can access because they maybe were shamed when they've seen it modeled. They see, we kind of believe it works. It actually doesn't work. Actually, caring about people, that works. We can't do that if we're yelling, and we can't get out of our yelling unless we're centered in ourselves. So when I finally understood that, it was like, wow, this is the heart of where we need to go. And this is why I'm so passionate about the work that I need to do, that I am doing, that we are doing as an organization, as people in the world, because I feel like I'm working on my own personal transformation, and I'm helping other people go through their own personal transformation so we can make the changes we need to make in the world.
One of the reasons I wanted to go into coaching because I was working in a nonprofit or a Dutch foundation actually at the
Mhm.
time. And one of the things that I saw is that I was becoming quite disillusioned with the impact that we were having. Although the projects were really cool and there was impact, it wasn't really that systemic impact. We would go into a specific community and make a really small incremental impact in people's lives, but everything else around it. So let's say sanitation, we can improve the quality of the water, but we can't improve then necessarily the quality of the education and the incidences of gender-based violence, just schooling, education. There's so many other elements that contributes to a good life. And we would go
Exactly.
in and make an incremental change. And that doesn't mean it's not an important change, but I was starting to become really critical of my own impact in the world. And then I just noticed that, hey, I've been working with this, more junior colleague or a peer on their leadership skills or on their project management skills or on actually making sense of the really hard things that they were seeing, out in
Mhm.
the communities that we were working. And I was like, I think this is the biggest impact I'm having right now. And
Yes.
that then really spurred me to say, let me focus on that. And then I think to what you're saying is that if we can all, heal ourselves, be more centered, and even in our families start having an impact, then hopefully that will kind of radiate out that butterfly effect.
Yeah, it's exactly true. That's exactly what we think. Yeah. And even if our work is incremental, but we just believe that each increment makes such a difference because it, like you said, it can have ripple effect further out, right? And all those ripple effects, those are all important. Hard to measure for everybody who wants evidence-based measures, which a lot of people do. But ultimately, it's where I think the biggest change will happen.
I want to talk a little bit about resilience. You've, of course, touched on it already throughout this conversation. What I really like about the way that you frame resilience, and I actually saw that on the poster that came together with the book, was resilience helps us become the best possible version of ourselves. And what I took from that is a very proactive, active framing of resilience, whereas the way I've heard it being spoken about in the past is something that just kind of sits there dormant. Either you are resilient, and if something hits you, you're going to be okay. Whereas this book and the framework that you've built really makes it something that we can actively do and practice and improve on. And so I would love if you can just explain to us a bit, what is resilience and how does it show up for us, especially in our careers?
Such a great question. I think resilience is the foundation, right, of everything that we do. A lot of people think of it in terms of the ability to bounce back, right? And that's true. And we think it allows us to look forward to life with hope. It helps us problem solve. We can be more authentic, gives us empathy, feel grounded. It's the awareness, mindsets, and skills to create the best version of ourselves, as we talked about, right? I feel like if people only get one message, it's what you just said. We can be intentional about it and we can strengthen it. We name the approach that we use and talk about we are resilient because we want to honor the fact that we all have resilience. Absolutely. Like you said, it's dormant in all of us, but it's actually not dormant. It's active all the time. We also named 5 different types of actual resilience as a way of distinguishing the little types of resilience so that we can be more intentional about the skills and mindsets that we need to strengthen it. So the first type of resilience we talk about is actually our reactive resilience. And that's the resilience that happens when we react to something we feel a little bit vulnerable about or we feel unsafe. And we can have anything like we can avoid, we can attack, maybe we have a distrusting protective pattern, maybe we have a hypervigilance protective pattern. Hypervigilance is when we see problems everywhere and we're ready to check. Maybe our reactive resilience actually shows up as hyper caretaking, so we're taking care of other people's problems instead of our own, and maybe we're defending. So these are the 6 protective patterns that we emerge during our reactive resilience. And if you want to see how that shows up in your professional life, like you get the email and the email says, you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z. And you're like, I'm not going to do it. Or I'm going to put that email away and I'm not going to pay attention to it. I mean, there's just a million ways. If you're at home, you might have, a family member come in and say they want dinner. And you're like, well, why didn't you prepare dinner? And that's your defending protective pattern. I have an attacking protective pattern that comes out too often. So my husband says, I have a tech question. I'm like, I'm in the middle of a project. Why are you bothering me now? Not my most best self, but it still helps. The thing about our protective patterns is that they can hurt us. They might hurt you if you avoid that email that came through your boss telling you to do a project that you don't want, but you're just avoiding it. But they also can help us. Sometimes we avoid situations. Maybe something comes through and you're like, I'm not going to deal with it. And then you find out it's resolved and you didn't have to deal with it in the first place. So all these protective patterns can be helpful for us and they can be harmful. And one of the things that we do in our training and our work is help people learn to notice. Oh, that's what's going on. And by noticing, you can say, oh, that's helpful or not. So that's one type of resilience, reactive. Another type of resilience, we talked about cultural resilience. And our cultural patterns, how we view the world, gives us our cultural resilience. Our cultural patterns include all sorts of messages about how we should behave or not behave in the world. And they're made up of everything from both our ethnicity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, all the family stories that we got. But it also includes political affiliation, religious traditions, social economics, all these things mix. From all those things, you get many messages about how you should be in the world. And that gives us our cultural resilience, and we can move and navigate in the world. So if we're in a professional situation, as you said, you're in a meeting, one of the things that comes up often in work is different communication patterns. Some people, like you can tell, I can just keep on talking. I'm a big talker. And that's a cultural pattern that I got growing up. Oh yeah, we just all talk on top of each other. And one of my colleagues never interrupts. I'm not going to interrupt. That's his cultural pattern. Well, in an office full of talkers, he's not going to get a word in edgewise. So we learn to navigate those cultural patterns and develop cultural resilience about communication style. The other three types of resilience, we have personal resilience. That's what we usually think of in terms of resilience. Oh, something happened to me and now I'm strong. I bounce back. Then relational resilience. That's when we're in relationship with people and we understand we can still work through challenges and difficulties that come up in that. And in fact, it can strengthen the resilience. So if you have a life partner, hopefully your relational resilience can be strong. You're working, of course, on that with your children or other people in your family, people that you care about. But even colleagues, you want to have strong relational resilience so you move through that relationship good. And then I think I talked about already the group resilience. When you have a group that's trying to solve something or they have some kind of vision, something they want to do together, and how can we together achieve what we need to do and maximize everyone's contribution. By maximizing people's contribution, then you get the best out of the group and we can really do what we want to do.
Find it such a helpful approach because it's not only either you have resilience or you don't, and go meditate so you can be more resilient. But I think the way that you frame it, it's so multifaceted. And I can imagine that, you can focus on some of the elements right now and over time improve some of the others. And I think it just is such a helpful approach to see where am I right now and where do I want to focus. One of the biggest ones that stood out for me from the book was this concept within reactive resilience around distrusting.
Oh, yes,
And
distrusting.
distrusting myself, this is maybe just a really practical example for people, is that I always say I'm a huge procrastinator and perfectionist. So whether it is sending an email, I feel absolutely ridiculous, but sometimes me, quite experienced now in my career, can sit for an hour and try and word an email perfectly. Or I can sit with a project and start doing the planning, but never really get started on it for weeks because I want that plan perfect. And I was always just saying, okay, it's perfectionism. I need to get over that. It's procrastination. I just need to be harder on myself and stick to my plan. But when I read the book, I was like, I think it comes from distrusting
Yes.
because my mom was always very perfectionistic as well. And, it's that typical story. The whole house can be clean, but there's one dirty cup in the sink. And then it's like chaos, And so it's like going back to that email, checking it. Did I miss something? Is it right? What state of mind is that person? Rather than just saying, I trust myself to take in the information on this email, I trust myself to process it and to do an appropriate response and send it off. And also trusting myself that whatever comes out of that, I can deal with it. And so I've been doing kind of a bit of a trick with myself now, is like just kind of having that as a mantra. I trust myself that I'm have what it takes in this situation to do what's needed. And that has been a huge unlock. It's a small example from the book, but it's been super powerful.
Oh my goodness, I can't tell you how that warms my heart because this is exactly why we do the work, right? Because you have to go into the nitty-gritty details like you talked about. So one protective pattern, how does distrusting show up in my life? I think it's showing up in not being able to get these emails out. And then you look and say, where does that come from? We talk about our cultural patterns and how and protective patterns and where we might have gotten. You said, oh, maybe it's because my mother got upset about having the cup in the sink, right? And then you're like, oh, I can approach this a different way. You walked us through perfectly. Yeah, I have options, and that's resilient mindset of choice. I have a choice to do something different. I'm going to use that. And you also use the resilient mindset of curiosity because you said, where do I think I got this? And you discovered where you might have gotten. You made the choice to do it, which takes courage. Those are our three resilient mindsets, to do the hard work and say, I'm not going to just keep saying, oh, I'm a procrastinator. That's just what happens. You're going to do the hard work and say, I'm going to try a mantra and see how that works. It's a great example of the why we do the work we do. Thank you so much for sharing that.
So one of the other things that came up for me was avoiding. And I realized that I do that in small ways, but also in really big ways. There's a lot of things that I would have framed quite negatively towards myself, like this is a negative behavior, but it's actually a resilient behavior. So that's just what I wanted to understand a bit.
Absolutely, right? So it's reactive resilience. It gives us resilience. We learned it for a reason. You learned to be distrusting because your mother had a fit if she found a dirty cup in the sink. There's a good reason we have those skills, and they continue to work for us sometimes better than others. So when you're avoiding at your work situation, maybe you avoided, maybe it was actually helpful. It's important to understand, and this is why our protective patterns are named protective patterns, because sometimes they use it that they protect us, and sometimes that's good. And it's good to know that and honor it. We are not bad, shameful, horrible people for doing all the whatever X's. They're there for a reason.
Brilliant. If someone wants to work on their resilience, learn more about the work that you're doing or the book, where can they go? Where do they find more information? And if they find it overwhelming, where would you say they should start?
Oh, great question. So we have this book, The Heart of Resilience. It's available on our website, www.dovetaillearning.org. You can also order it on Amazon if you'd like to give Jeff Bezos more money, so that's possible too. And then we also have a lot of courses and trainings. We have online courses you can take, and then you're in a group because, as you said, people learn best from stories. We also have developed a online self-guided course for people who are like, I just don't want to be in a group. I want to be by myself. So you're welcome to do that. The self-guided one is going to launch, I think, in another month, but you can go on and express interest and we can send you the link to it. Obviously, get our newsletter. Our newsletter has just one bite every 2 weeks, a little story about how resilient works. So it's just an ongoing way to sort of get the drip feed about how you can do resilience. And we have so many videos that you can watch on YouTube, webinars, half an hour, 45-minute webinars on different topics all around this type of resilience. And we also have lots of materials you can download for free to just get a sense of. Those are more training materials, so they're not as easy to get into as the book. That's why we promote the book more, because the book is story-led. We interviewed more than 100 people about how resilience works in their life, so you get examples about how the approach works for them.
Thank you. And we'll make sure to include all the links in the description so people can easily find it. Is there any other thoughts or reflections from your side that we haven't touched on yet that you wanted to make sure to share with listeners?
I think the biggest one for me is just relationships. Who are you working with? Always pay attention to that. If you're in a work situation and the relationships aren't working, that's time to think about what else you might look at, what else you might do, because you can't change people very easily. If you're working with people that really are hard to work with, they're really bothering you, don't align with your values, that's going to be really hard to change over time.
So, if you're good to go to the last 5 questions.
Yes.
All right. So, the first question is, if you didn't have to work, what would you be doing with your time?
I would be doing exactly what I'm doing now. I love it.
The second question, and maybe it's the same answer, but if you had to choose one of your past jobs to do for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Yeah, it would be this one. Mostly because it brings together, like when I was doing the work at the church, I learned about training. When I was working in healthcare, I learned about all these different types of issues. When I was working in education, I learned about how to educate people. I mean, I've learned so many different things in different jobs, and the current job brings together all those things.
I love that. I think sometimes when you're in experience, you think about like, how does this line up to what I want to be doing with my life? And sometimes you don't immediately have that answer, but you take that with you. You take that skill, you take that experience, and you never know how in future it's going to be fitting into the puzzle.
My favorite example of that is when Steve Jobs did calligraphy. I think after he dropped out of college, I think he wasn't, and he did calligraphy for a while. By doing calligraphy, he brought fonts to the Macintosh. Now I remember because I was using the early Macintosh in the mid 80s, okay? And it was so wonderful to have all these different fonts. And the use of fonts it's just changed how we see computers and everything else because he took a calligraphy course. Anyway, great example of we have no idea of how the things that we do in the world will circle back and enrich us in different ways.
This example, I actually didn't know that story. Thanks for sharing that. The third one, if you could get a do-over for one of your career decisions, which one would it be?
That's not an easy question, mostly because everything that I've done has taught me something. I think I was the most unhappy when I was working at the World Bank because my job was data and I was pulling data from the mainframe and creating tables and charts. Nothing that I love to do. But I hated it so much, it gave me energy every night at 5 o'clock to look for another job. I might not have had that energy if I wasn't so unhappy during the day. So it's just an example about how everything can be turned into something.
I think that's the power of reframing. Another theme that you talk about in your book. I love that concept of reframing. And I think that's something that's so powerful that I've discovered with people that are successful in the sense that they are happy in life, happy with what they're doing, really have that skill of reframing more, let's say, negative or disappointing experiences in their past. And when you talk to them and they tell their story, it just sounds like it was all smooth sailing. But then when you say, hey, you actually had that divorce. That must have been really hard. Or, hey, you were actually retrenched from that job. That must have been really hard. They say, I guess that was actually hard, but it's that reframing. So, the fourth one, if you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of career advice, what would it be?
I think it would be that it's okay to zig and zag. It's okay you do not have to have a straight line. Keep going, and you will find things that are fulfilling out there, and you will find great people to work with. Just keep knocking on the doors, even if it's really hard. Yeah.
The very last one is just for you to complete the sentence. When I grow up,
I don't know if there is a growing up. That's the one thing I will say I have learned, and honestly, it's scary. Just like 2 years ago, that I'm going to be learning until my very last breath. For some reason, I thought there was a when I grow up, I would get X and I would achieve X and I would be Y or whatever. There's no line. Just enjoy what you can while you're doing it, because you're going to keep learning and changing and growing all the way along, all the way until our very last breath, whenever that is.
absolutely love that. And that is actually exactly why I chose this name for the podcast, because I feel it's such a challenging question. We ask 5-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? And we ask them when they go study, and we ask them in their 20s when they're going to their first job. But the answer is you never actually get to that answer. You ask that question in so many different ways, and you answer that question in so many different ways. And so I love that. Thanks so much, Meri, for your time, for sharing your story and the resilience approach. I found the book extremely valuable. So thank you very much for writing it and for doing so with so much vulnerability.
Thank you. This has been a joy. I so appreciate both you reaching out and just knowing you for so long. It's been wonderful.